Okay. Well, for those of you I don't know, my name is Eric Cohen. I'm the executive director here at TICFA, and it's really an incredible pleasure for me to be engaging today in this conversation with my dear friend, teacher, mentor, Dr. Leon Kass. So this is part of a whole series of conversations that we launched under the umbrella of the Jewish Parents Forum. And the idea of the Jewish Parents Forum was to try to help Jewish parents who want to pass down a strong Jewish identity, a strong Zionist identity, a deep attachment to the majestic heritage of the Jewish people to their children. And to do it in a moment where social media, where the culture, where oftentimes schools and even sadly, even synagogues are often embrace ideas that cut against those deeply held Jewish values that are so important to pass down to the young. And where all of us as parents, and I certainly include myself in this as the father of four, are thinking about how do we meet that sacred responsibility and that great challenge in our cultural moment today of raising strong, morally serious, morally courageous, deeply committed young Jews who can hopefully continue our tradition from generation to generation. And what we saw and what we heard is that many of the thousands of people that have signed up so far for this series were not parents, but grandparents. And they were eager to listen in on these conversations, to be engaged, and to work with us in trying to strengthen Jewish identity in their own distinctive ways as grandfathers and as grandmothers. So we thought we would begin a series of conversations on that theme. And I can imagine no one better to begin this series than Dr. Kass. I first met Dr. Kass a couple decades ago when I sat in on a panel after he wrote a book called The Hungry Soul, which included a very moving chapter about something I had really never thought about, which was the meaning of keeping kosher and why that was such an important idea. And that for me was one of the beginnings of my own recovery of my own Jewish inheritance. I later had the privilege of working with Dr. Kass when he was the chairman of the President's Council on Bioethics, thinking with him, learning with him, and discovering together how important it was to lean on the Hebraic tradition to think about the very nature of our humanity in the current age. And I'll now say he's written many books, but my very favorite book, and I really mean this, is the book that he just published with his granddaughter called Reading Ruth, which is the product of many conversations that they had together that led to really producing one of the most wonderful meditations on love, family, fidelity, all the things that should connect grandfathers and granddaughters. So Leon, we're really honored to welcome you to this conversation and to dive right in.
Thanks, Eric. It's wonderful to be with you. And this is a subject dear to my heart.
So. Well, that much I know. So look, before we can think about grandparents, let's think a little bit about grandchildren. And I guess my first question, Leon, would be, isn't this challenge of passing down a strong Jewish identity, a strong commitment to a Jewish way of life, this is kind of an old problem. Certainly in the modern age, an old problem. One can read Sholem Aleichem's stories and see all the challenges he faced in thinking about, passing down a Jewish way of life to his children. So I guess what I would ask is there something about American culture today, modern culture today, that makes this challenge of Jewish perpetuation particularly salient? Is there something about our traditional Jewish values that are being upended in ways that are unique? Haven't the young always revolted against their parents and grandparents? What is it that Jewish grandchildren face as we think about handing something down to them?
Look, modernity, the various modernities of the past have presented challenges to the Jewish way in the diaspora, certainly. But I think, and America is on the one hand, it's probably easier to be Jewish in America, leaving Israel to the side, than it has been at any time in any place for centuries, precisely because of the tolerance, the openness, and so on. But it turns out that American culture, and especially over the last half century and increasingly in the last few decades, is, it seems to me, less and less, it's more tolerant, but it's less friendly in terms of its own dominant culture to the things that we as Jews care about and stand for. the growing vulgarity, shallowness, coarseness of the popular culture, the addicting mediation of the screen, and the attraction of all kinds of things that have absolutely nothing to do with enduring values. The shortness of attention. America has always been a country in which the present and the future have had a great advantage over traditionalism. We are a forward-looking and progressing nation, but the cultural change now is so rapid and so self-indulgent and so intent on people having their rights and indulging their preferences. The culture doesn't support a view of duties, responsibilities, and obligations, which are the central moral notions of our tradition. And it's less and less a spiritual nation. There are pockets of serious Christians and serious Jews, but they are increasingly, I think, against the stream. So I think it is much more difficult now, and we have much more work to do to hand things on which we received. It's an always difficult task, but it's our mission to keep alive and pass on what we got and maybe even make it better.
I mean, one of the things that's worried many of us is the kind of rise of what people have called identity politics. You know, we've heard a lot about critical race theory and classifying people based on their racial identities, and the victim cult, the victims and the privileged. I wonder what you think about, how do we thread the needle of, on the one hand, trying to pass down a deep identity, and in our case, a Jewish identity, without ever succumbing to the temptations and distortions of identity politics? How do you see the difference between those two, dimensions of trying to form committed, serious young Jews who believe in their own inheritance, and never succumb to the kind of grievance culture that is at the heart of identity politics?
Look, Jews have been somewhat clannish. We're accused of it. It's not altogether false. We don't always vote our interests, but we look out for our interests in various ways. We have all kinds of local social organizations, and people look after their own, and we're very good at it. We don't simply rely on the larger culture to take care of our own. But we haven't generally participated in America as an identity and arguing simply for what's good. Jewish Americans have been Americans for the most part. And I think we're sort of taken by surprise that these other identities arise really with grievances against the dominant culture, so I don't think, I don't think we're tempted by that. I think we're hurt by it. We're in a way one of the few identities that doesn't get special treatment. And in fact, those identities find the Jews a perfectly willing target because we don't like to be thought to be insensitive to other people's grievances. And we're not very good at fighting back. But look, there was a time when America went multicultural, and instead of the melting pot, which was a pot in which Jews were very happily melting, that was certainly the time of my growing up in the 40s and 50s. We went to this time of multiculturalism, where hyphenated American was a way of celebrating your particular ethnic background. And it was a time actually when Jews also, you began to get Jewish studies program in universities. One didn't hide it. And it was possible to sort of celebrate one's Americanism and one's Jewishness. That was not a time really of identity politics, but a kind we could celebrate our own in public in a way in which one didn't do that when one was looking to assimilate and make sure that nobody thought we were sort of had dual loyalties and weren't fully American. I think for the most part, the Jews are still playing that older game, and I don't see why we shouldn't.
So let's talk about grandparents. You know, in this sacred responsibility of trying to hand down a thick Jewish set of commitments, values, way of life, what is the unique role of a grandfather or a grandmother? And how are grandparents different than parents, both in their sense of what's needed and in the nature of their relation with their grandchildren?
Yeah, look, I mean, if there are lots of people listening in, there are probably as many varieties of being a grandparent as there are, as we have here together on this call. But I think there are a few generalizations, and I begin with a joke which my granddaughter just told me this week. She said, "So, why are grandparents and grandchildren? Why are they such close friends?" And the answer is they have a common enemy. And there's in a way something to it. The serious point is the grandparents have done the task in the trenches. They're responsible for the day-to-day hectic life of making sure everything is taken care of. They have the responsibility of
This is the parents now you're talking.
the parents, yeah, the parents have those daily responsibilities. They have to do the scolding, the picking up after they're tired, they're exhausted. And the grandparents have a certain distance. I mean, all of the truisms about the blessings of being a grandparent, all the joy and none of the responsibilities, that's true. But it also means that we haven't retired from the playing field to the bleachers. We're in the coach's box. And when our children become parents, it's the first time that they actually will see the world from our side. That's just existentially speaking. I'm not yet talking Jewishly speaking. We have a certain distance. The relations that we have with the grandchildren are unencumbered really by the frictions and tensions and hustle and bustle of the daily interactions. The times are separated, and the opportunities for doing things in a more leisurely way without all of the usual tensions of daily life. Second, and I'm talking about the best case. There are cases which are off, but in the ideal case, both the parents and especially the grandparents see us as somehow links to the past. We're, after all, the parents of their parents, so they get to see their parents also in relation to us, and they get to somehow see in action something like intergenerational connection, which is absolutely of the essence of Judaism. This business of continuity, not just of who you marry, but of what you think and what you teach, and especially how you live. We are models for them, even without knowing it, in terms of just who we are, of what we say, of what we do. And here I think is a very important part, which is very often tacit and we don't make enough of it. We've seen all kinds of things that they will never have seen. We know something about the fragility of Jewish life in the world. Those of us who have some memory of the Second War and its aftermath and the Holocaust survivors, we know something about the unbelievable miracle of the birth of the state of Israel and its existential battles. We know also how this was an ingathering of the people, and we have lived, and we probably, many of us have had to claim our own Jewish life. We didn't start with a life as richly Jewish as we've made it, as over the years we've given up some of the other idolatries that we thought would answer to the deep longings of the soul, and have found in what we've inherited what we now know is really worth passing on. So, and from our own side, and I think any grandparent who spent any time even thinking of it, we are closer to the end of days than they are. We're mindful of the fragility of life, as well as of the permanent things which can survive if we do our part in making sure that they continue to live. We have that kind of sense of time, and of both the shortness of time and the eternity of what is ours to pass on. And in that sense, we have the leisure for it because we're not scrambling all the time, or if we're lucky. So in all these ways, we have a kind of unique position psychologically, existentially, historically. We've learned a few things, we've made a lot of mistakes. And I think that I'll speak for not just for myself, but lots of us at this particular time of life. It's not just that we're afraid of dying and therefore are going to rush into the synagogue and try to increase the balance on the good side of the scale. I think we've come to see what's lasting, what's enduring, what's important. And the question is, how in a world which is not friendly to what's lasting and what's important, can we take what we have learned, what we've come to know, and what we embody in ourselves and have this be, it doesn't have to be explicit. A lot of it is tacit, but there are things we can do and ways in which we can somehow show by example and in fact help our own children be the bearers of this to the grandchildren.
So you've written this beautiful book with your granddaughter, which is a real meditation on the biblical book of Ruth. And to the extent that you're willing to share, I'm just, curious, how did this come about? Why the book of Ruth? What is it in that book that became such a deep set of insights into the very themes you were talking about? Love, fidelity, continuity, Judaism, the perpetuation of the Jewish way. Why Ruth? Why this book? How did this all come about?
Look, I'll try to do this without sort of trespassing on the intimate relation that brought this about, without saying too much about it. But this began after my dear Amy passed away. It's coming up on 7 years. And this 16-year-old Israeli granddaughter, with whom I've always been very close, and she has a very old soul. And she said to me probably a month afterwards, Zeta, maybe you'd like to read something with me. And she was in Israel and I was in Washington. And we just settled on the book of Ruth. It's short. Amy loved it. I loved it. And I thought it was, we had made some discovery in it that I thought would unlock the book 20 years ago. And I never wrote it down. I didn't remember what it was. So I thought maybe if I'm reading this with Hannah, we might uncover it. And over FaceTime for about 3 months, 2-3 times a week for an hour, we do a couple of sentences, talk about, read them aloud, discuss them. What does this mean? And it wasn't intended to be a book, but it turned out to be, it's eerie. I mean, that she would have asked me in a time that both of us are grieving, and that we've settled on a book which is about nothing so much as the redemptive power of procreation and the importance of sort of redeeming the dead, that their memories shall not, that their names shall not be lost in Israel. And that, it's a kind of providential thing that we should have landed in this place, talked about it, and allowed the book to teach us something about the very experience that we were somehow engaged in, without even knowing that that's where it would turn out. This is one of the ways. It was at a time that I was particularly susceptible to this. She was very forthcoming. Um, and but one of the ways in which one can make connection is to find ways to fulfill the ancient Jewish exhortation, you shall tell your child on that day. Well, it's not just on that day. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which we can find in events large and small to pass on what we know. Not all of it has to be simply labeled Jewish. I mean, if one can talk about the ethics that we've inherited, the moral teachings, the respect and care for strangers and for the widows and the poor, what it means to keep a calendar, the various other kinds of stories that are edifying and illuminating, and actually discuss them as if they're still somehow relevant to us. There are lots of opportunities to do it. The other thing I would say, Eric, is it's very hard in America with people living far apart to do what used to be done under circumstances where people were lived closer together, never mind in ghettos. But we have a calendar. We have Shabbat, we have a calendar. It's not only that there are things should be read and told, but the ritualization of time, the commemoration of time around these things, various gestures, they build not just conceptual attachments, but they build the habits of the heart. They cultivate the sentiments. It's very nice, and I'm spent my life reading books and trying to get the ideas, but in some ways, my own Jewishness, which is very different from where I started, its roots were in my home, speaking Yiddish. I had almost no connection with my grandparents. Two of them I didn't know. One died when I was 3. The other one died when I was 7. But certain kinds of customs, of language, of gathering around Jewish things, those make a lasting impression. So do the songs, so do the music. So there are things that we know which are countercultural today, but they're really great resources. And we have the standing in the families if we don't simply treat ourselves as appendages, but somehow step forward, invite, lead, demonstrate.
And you really anticipated what I wanted to ask you next, which is not only the problem of distance, and how do you form these deep connections between grandparents and grandchildren when they're often spread apart. I think COVID has probably made that worse in the last couple of years and contributing to the challenge of just being together. There's also the problem of busyness, meaning as a father of 4 young kids, I know their schedules and the craziness. So I guess my question is, how does a grandparent find a way to break through the reluctant grandchild, the less than available grandchild, the too far away grandchild, meaning, how do you find a way to puncture the many gates that sometimes exist that get in the way of forming this deep connection across these generations? Is there any practical insights you would share about how to break through so that those habits of connection can begin to form?
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is not easy, and there isn't a simple thing to say, but part of the question is, are our children, which is to say our grandchildren's parents, are they on the same page with us or not? Are we having to fight their idolatries and the things that they want most for their children, that all of the activities, all of the things that if they do it right, they can get into Princeton, and never mind that it, involves breaking Shabbat or doing various other things. But if one has passed on sufficiently to the children, and it's a concern not only for you, for us, but our own children as parents of our grandchildren, then it becomes then one can get in the parents a certain alliance on this subject, and one then builds particular times to get together. One has to find the times and set aside the time, and it has to be treated as somehow the grandparents are coming. They'll be here for this time. What shall we do? And let's figure out how to make this time, I don't mean in a heavy-handed way, but how can we make this more Jewishly meaningful? The other thing, which is very much against the stream, but not a lot of young people are interested in the stories of old people, but some of them are. And we shouldn't be shy about talking about what we've seen and what we know. They will be sorry later that they didn't get it. My granddaughter here, I'm speaking in Jerusalem. One of my younger granddaughters had a project to do the family history for school. This is high school. And she interviewed me for 3 hours and took it all down, needed photographs. It never would have occurred to me before she started with me that, this is important to her now and will be even more important to her later. So to find the occasions when it's not, I got a lot of stuff to tell you that if you listen up, it'll be good for you. No, but there have to be somehow occasions where questions are generated and where some of the sensibilities, some of the stories, some of the experiences, some of the things that matter, we assume too often that it's the most easy assumption, and it's absolutely wrong, that the thing that we've learned over a long lifetime is just common knowledge and comes from experience. But they didn't live in our world. They haven't seen it. And to the extent that we can find ways to talk about this and to talk about it Jewishly speaking, that also plants a certain connectedness.
It occurs to me when you say the importance of grandparents being willing, almost, with real loving authority to share what they know. I wonder if there are also occasions where grandparents, have to, in a sense, share what they don't know.
Yeah.
Which, all families are different in their Jewish, journeys, to use that phrase. It's commonly used, are very different. There are probably many families where the grandchildren actually know more about Judaism than the grandparents. And the opportunity for connection is, in a way, a two-way street, meaning which is, what a privilege it would be to learn from my grandson or granddaughter who's attending a Jewish school or participating in a Jewish camp and had the privilege to learn things that I'm now wise enough to know I should have learned or would have liked to have learned. And you, in a sense, elevate the relation by elevating the grandchild and elevating the Jewish project by saying, you may be 11, but boy, I want to learn from you. I bet there are a lot of situations where that's also the case.
You hit me right between the eyes. This afternoon.
I've done that before.
No, this afternoon, I have my younger granddaughter here who's just turned 19. She's studying for the year in Lindenbaum Midrashah. And she asked me, Zeta, would you like to come and have a chavruta with me this afternoon? And then she emails me, how would you like to do the Megillah? I said, terrific. She comes in with text, and she's been studying this, and she's been studying the Mishnah on this. And I learned 3 or 4 things from her in an hour and a half. Okay. And it was also true, by the way, in our own household, because I wasn't raised religiously at all. But we sent our older daughter, the one who lives here now, to day school. And she was coming home with stuff I knew nothing about. So though I think this is, and on those occasions, the invitation to become the student of one's children or one's grandchildren is a way of giving them the pride of the pride of actually knowing and teaching and seeing that you have ratified the importance of what they are now doing. That's crucial.
So in a minute, I'd like to open it up. We have a lot of people participating, and I'd love to hear some of their questions. And Simon, in a minute, maybe we'll bring you on the screen to help moderate that. And I encourage everybody to put their questions either into the Q&A or the chat. It looks like the Q&A is probably the best way to do it, and we'll try to take as many as we can. I guess my last question, Leon, is in a way a practical one, which is, you found, separated by an ocean, a way of connecting with your granddaughter, through FaceTime, through reading this book together. Of course, you're probably not, you're not an ordinary grandfather, and I'm guessing she's not an ordinary grandchild. But my question is, what are some practical ideas you might share, whether it's things people could read or watch together, or, give people the kind of, you need some substance of connection, whether that's learning or experience, what practical advice might you offer to grandparents who are looking for the right opening to build what I would call these habits of connection? Whether they live close together or whether they live far apart.
Yeah, look, I mean, everybody's circumstances are going to be different. If you've got people who are synagogue goers, and at least for the time being, the grandchildren are still going, you have Parsha Shavua. Whether you live nearby or far, one can say, look, grandchildren's time, let's talk about one thing that was in the Parsha. 15 minutes. They have a common experience. The young people, actually, if they're a certain age, if they're under 13, they're still can be made enthusiastic about these things without terribly much competition. That's to find occasions that are already part of their Jewish experience and join them in them, ratify it, share it. It will be remembered forever that I had, for 6 months, I had weekly conversations with my grandfather, my grandmother, about something that I read. There is music that can be shared and sent around. There are things which don't involve us so much directly, except through our pocketbooks. But I asked Hannah, my Israeli, the older granddaughter here, I said, what should I tell people if they ask me, what can they do for their grandchildren? She said, have them pay for summer camp, Camp Ramah, Camp Stone. Why? Because what you have there is the intense bonding experience of Jewish people your own age joyously around the Jewish experience. Friendships are formed there for a lifetime, etc. And she said they should pay for a gap year in Israel so that they would have a kind of intense experience where being Jewish is not somehow at odds with what goes on around you, but it's of the essence. I'm not arguing that you should encourage your grandchildren to make Aliyah, but they should have something of a taste of what it means to live in a sovereign place and with where everything is Jewish, the language, the calendar, all of those sorts of things. Look, I think if everybody's circumstances are going to be different, one has to look for those places where there are opportunities in terms of the tastes of the grandchildren, the points of connection. If you've got a grandchild who's interested in history, one can feed that. If you've got a grandchild who's interested in music, there's all kinds of Jewish music. But it means actually actively taking up the question, what are my opportunities?
It sounds like also, and Simon, I want to, after this comment, have you jump on and we'll start taking some questions, but it sounds like as important, maybe even more important than the specific content that you might share with a grandchild is the ritualization of time together. Meaning that part of the genius of the Jewish calendar and of the Jewish way of life is the sanctification and setting aside of time that means something specific in different moments and different rhythms of life. And if there's some piece of the week or of the month that belongs to the grandparent and the grandchild together, that's almost as important as what they might do together, especially if it's, for our purposes, is in a Jewish key. And then the two, or maybe it's more than two, the grandparents and the grandchildren may find their way Jewishly together, but there's at least a space that has been set aside for that. That sounds like it was central to your experience with your granddaughter and reading Ruth together.
Yeah, no, look, that's exactly right. A lot of this conveying is done by who we are, what we show we care about. It's less a question of the didactic teaching. It's that we're somehow invested in them. Right. And we also are open to learning from them, that we have a kind of bond. And by the way, they keep us young. So this is not just a one-way transmission, but there is it matters to us to see that what we have tried to build has survival, right. So that this is energizing to both sides, and time is of the essence.
Right. Okay, Simon, I see we have a ton of questions flowing in here. I turn it over to you to try to get as many in as we can. And Leon, I'll keep you honest and trying to answer as many as we can.
Sure. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Dr. Kass. So folks, if you do want to ask a question, you can hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom, and we will try to get to as many as we can in the remaining time. So I thought I'd start off with an easy one that we've been getting from a few people, which the version of the question is, how would you approach disagreements with the common enemy, the parents in between you and the grandchildren when it comes to Jewish upbringing?
I asked for that, didn't I?
You set yourself up for this one, Leon.
Yeah, look, first of all, you listen. You listen. You have to. You have to hear what's being, I'm talking about listening to the grandchildren. The parents will come, sometimes they will come for advice, tearing their hair. Sometimes you have something to offer. Sometimes you have an insight into them that they don't have, that is helpful in the way they're dealing with their children. But general maxim would be, the Jewish way is honor your father and mother. And the grandparents are somehow, they cannot simply take the side of rebellion. They can be sympathetic and so on, but there are so many cases, but generally speaking, sympathetic listening, encourage the children to see as well as possible. If there is parental wisdom, it should be reinforced. There are a million such circumstances that will be exceptions to what I've just said, but yeah, I think that you're in a position to get to be a sympathetic ear, and I get it all the time. But it's possible to show, actually, if you really understood what your parents were saying, it wouldn't look to you like this, or you may have misunderstood. And occasionally a nice word on the side of the parents would help things along.
The other version of this, and let's take the next question, is what do grandparents do when they know the parents are being foolish? Should grandparents defer to the foolishness of parents or try to correct the foolishness of parents in the lives of their grandchildren? I'm going to not make you answer that.
I won't.
Let's take the next one.
Sure. So this is, I guess, sort of tangentially related, but a lot of folks are writing in and they want to know what they can do to inculcate the idea of endogamy, marrying within the tribe to grandchildren, especially in circumstances where you might have a case where the parent generation in between is maybe themselves be intermarried, but the grandparents want to foster a sense that it's important to marry Jewish. So how would you sort of steer grandchildren delicately in that situation? And also, if you could comment, if you have any ideas on how folks can encourage their grandchildren to meet other other potential Jewish partners. A lot of people are asking about that.
Yeah. Look, on the first question, there's massive concern about intermarriage. And Jewish continuity is undermined by that. I would say that if as much attention was spent on what it was, why it was one wanted to be vitally Jewish as opposed to what the ethnicity was of the bride or groom to be, I won't say will simply take care of itself. The heart sometimes springs over boundaries and can't be restrained. But I think if people were, if one worried less about the question, if the first question was not the question of intermarriage, but the first question was love what's Jewish, you will find that the people you find most congenial and the people whose company you like are the people who share your heritage to which you are yourself attached. In other words, a kind of rich Jewish identity, a celebration of it, something that really matters, will contribute much more to actually dealing with the other question. And in the long run, this is not, I don't want to be casual about this, but in the long run, what one really cares about is not just that the name on the birth certificate is Jewish, but that a certain way of life is handed down. So I would place most of my emphasis on that. The summer camp, by the way, on the second question, and especially for teens and college age kids that become counselors and who've grown up in some of these places and rise to become counselors, other kinds of Jewish youth groups, the gap year, birthright, there are places where people form attachments, meet people. Yeah, I had a student a long time ago. I had a student who he was very interested in getting married. And he graduated college, and he said to me, he said, do you think he moved to a new city, do you think if I went to shul, start going to shul, I could meet Rachel, which was his. And I told him, I said, look, you go to shul looking for Rachel, you won't find her. if you go to shul looking for Torah, you might find Rachel too. And that is a kind of shorthand for, I think, both of these questions.
How did it work out for
This is a story and a half.
him?
The next time my wife and I were teaching the story of Jacob meets Rachel at the well in our course on courtship, this young man called me from Jerusalem inviting us to his wedding.
I'll simply add in this context that Tikva, as many people know, runs a lot of summer programs and gap year programs, and we've now been doing it long enough. We have many weddings, many Tikva weddings, which is
Yeah.
a source of great joy. Okay, Simon, what else we got?
Sure. So some people have been writing in and asking if you have any specific advice for dealing with the lack of affiliation with Israel that's present amongst a lot of the younger Jews today. If you have any advice for grandparents on sort of strengthening that bond.
I think seeing it is the best way if it can be done, either through birthright or gap year programs, or they have summer programs. Our younger daughter, who had very little interest in Israel, went for a summer to a summer program with 60 kids and came home just intoxicated with it. And she and her new husband went for the first year, spent a summer on a kibbutz. There's volunteering. It's very hard in the present circumstance where, look, for those of us who saw it coming into being, who saw the ingathering of the exiles and the refugees, who saw a country which was in peril all the time, and I don't want to say it's not in peril today, but it's strong. And it's not a new vulnerable country. It's an old and vigorous country. The Jews elicited much more sympathy when it looked like they were going to be destroyed. But now that they're strong, a country that distrusts strength now regards them as oppressors. And that's what the general culture is going to say. And if they go out in the community, they're going to be very hard pressed to make the case of Israel when they're occupiers of the West Bank, et cetera. Intellectual arguments in the absence of experience or the absence of knowledge of history going to be very, very difficult. They're going to say, yeah, that's okay for you. That's what you saw, but the world is different, Grandpa. The way to see that the world is different and it's better than they could ever imagine is to come spend some time here and or wind up in programs that mix Israelis and Americans. Tikva has some summer programs that do that. That's the best way. I think argument by itself insufficient.
I wonder if I could interrupt with a question. It's a question that has never occurred to me before, but Leon, I'm curious what you would say. I think many of us have long seen America as a land largely free of anti-Semitism. Certainly that would have been my experience growing up for the most part. And yet we now look around and we're worried maybe there's a resurgence in different and new forms of anti-Semitism. Not to say that America is not the welcoming land of liberty that you presented earlier. Do you think it's possible that grandparents have a better insight into the problem of anti-Semitism that their grandchildren might face, that parents actually don't understand as well? And that, you know, there's some connection, or is it, or have the forms of anti-Semitism so different today than they might have been in your experience that it's not deeply relevant? But I know certainly there are parents and grandparents worrying about the question of anti-Semitism in ways they haven't as intensively in a long time. Do grandparents have a unique insight to share on that, or you don't think so?
I don't know about this, Eric. I mean, I mean, partly the imbibed experience of my parents. My father came from the Ukraine, left right at the time of the Russian Revolution, and in Chicago, if we'd walk down the street past a church, he'd cross the street. Not by, he had no theory, he didn't say anything, but from ancient experience of his boyhood, he felt that out of that church might come some Ukrainian toughs. And I hate to say this in the present climate, but he had fear at every turn that there would be Christian Jew hatred and that they would suffer, and they would suffer violently. I grew up in Chicago. I think I had one experience as a boy where the kids from the local Catholic school beat me up because I killed Jesus. But for the rest of the time, it was nothing. And we grew up, I'm born in '39. I really grew up in post-war America. And there was none of this. And it was partly because in the aftermath of the Shoah, it was just indecent there were clubs that people couldn't enter, and the quotas in the Ivies only gradually began to fall through the 50s and 60s. But you just couldn't say anti-Jewish things in public. So I think, and maybe I'm just naive, but I grew up thinking, this isn't going to be a problem here. How could it be a problem here? And it's too complicated to explain all of this and whether the sources of it are different. Look, there is a reason why Jews will always be, I think, somewhat under suspicion if they're serious about their Judaism. We've been called and summoned to live a life dedicated to a purpose beyond ourselves, and to live in such a way as to vindicate the gift unmerited of being in God's image, with strong moral demands upon us. And we fail all the time. If we puff our chests out and say we're the chosen people, we're only inviting opprobrium. But we're also witnesses. We're in a kind of witness of a way of life that summons humanity to something higher. And that's hard to take. There's a kind of posture of you could do better to the world. And also the successes are the sources not of emulation so much as of envy and resentment. And this before you get to the grievance world of intersectionality, and anybody who's a victim belongs together. And so I'm not sure that my experience is very helpful to the present time, which is in a way unique. I think that the Jews are now looked upon as part of the oppressor class because we are privileged, because we're white, because we hold ourselves slightly aloof, because we're the last people in America who are willing to be called racists. So we'll keep our mouth shut and take it. I don't quite know how to combat this except through a certain pride in who we are and a willingness to stand up and defend.
It's a powerful answer. And it seems we're living in a moment where the only source of moral strength and moral courage and spiritual strength and courage is to have a deep identity in the face of a culture that is trying to unravel so much. And, you know, what to have been privileged to be born into this tradition, this way of life as a Jew, and whether this work between grandparents and grandchildren is an act of perpetuation or in some ways an act of recovery. Yeah. It is a responsibility to hand down something thick and real and deep, that grandparents either know and they want to make sure that they get it to their grandkids, or they've discovered for themselves late but that makes them all the more important and all the more devoted and dedicated to finding a Jewish ground to stand on together with their grandchildren, and trying to carve out a sacred space to do that together, I think is so important. And look, to us, it's a great privilege to begin this set of conversations on the theme of Jewish grandparenting, with the occasion being this book, because it's such an inspiring story of connecting with your own granddaughter, and through that experience, sharing some of your wisdom with the rest of us. So, Leon, as always, it's a great privilege to spend time together. We are grateful for the wisdom you've shared with us. And now you should go off and do some Haruta learning with one of your grandchildren here. The hundreds of people in our audience are much less important than the audience of your own grandchildren.
That I wouldn't say.
But Leon, from the depths of all of us, we thank you, and to everyone who's tuned in, we thank you for joining this event. Stay tuned for a lot of upcoming conversations in the Jewish Parents Forum, and I hope we'll all be together again soon. Leon, thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Eric.
Okay.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Good night.